No, it's so good to sing songs like that where we can glorify His name and concentrate on Him, because so often when we concentrate on ourselves, it can be really a scary kind of thing, a scary kind of experience. And so when we are able to concentrate on God and be reminded of His goodness, of His grace and His power, well, it just keeps us from being less, or keeps us from being more afraid. It lessens our fear. And what I am recognizing in so many people today, that so many people are afraid. In fact, in our world today, it seems like everything is trying to scare us so that we might be afraid. I mean, the idea of going to a horror movie or a scary movie, I've never understood that. Anybody are fans of being scared? You enjoy that feeling of being afraid? Anybody in this room? Okay, we got one here. About two or three. I don't get that. I don't know why people like to be scared and have these things that they can go to and haunted houses and all those kind of things to be afraid. I've never gotten that. If I want to be scared, I just read the newspaper. That's the only thing that I have to do, and that scares me enough. But you know, everything is trying to scare us in this world. And in fact, we are so afraid, they have come up with a name for this, being afraid, and they've come up with these ideas of phobias. You've heard of phobias, right? I was doing a little research this week on phobias, or things that people are afraid of. Sometimes these are irrational fears. Sometimes they are rational and wise fears to have. But I began to look up scientifically identified and that you can be diagnosed with these. And the number that I came up with of verifiable phobias was 530 phobias that are out there. These are 530 different things that people have been classified as being afraid of, so much so they have been recorded in some kind of reference book. And so I want to kind of test you this morning and see if you're afraid of any of these things. So if you have these fears, I'm not going to ask you to stand up or anything like that, because some of you probably have the fear of standing up. And so I don't want to scare those of you who might have that phobia. But some of you may have some of these phobias. This is sinophobia. This is not a fear of sin. That's not that. Some of us, I'm not sure any of us have that fear. We're pretty good at that. But sinophobia is the fear. Anybody know what that's a fear of? Anybody have this? It's the fear of dogs. That's just the kind of fear that you're afraid of. Now, those are probably not the kind of dogs you're afraid of. But I know that some of you might have been afraid of dogs and didn't want to scare you. So I thought I'd put some little cute, happy puppies up there. But there is something called sinophobia, which is a fear of dogs. There is also apparently somebody's really afraid of these phobias. There is the fear of agoraphobia. You know what the fear of agoraphobia is? It's the fear of kind of tight spaces, not being able to escape, sometimes even the fear of crowds. And so that's the reason you come to the first service, because there's not a big crowd here, so you're not afraid of anything. But that's one of the fears that's out there, the fear of not being able to escape, the fear of being trapped in, the fear of large groups of people. There's another fear of acrophobia. You know what acrophobia is? How many of you know what acrophobia is? You know what acrophobia is? All right. Acrophobia is the fear of what? Heights. And so I don't know if you've been out to the Grand Canyon or not, and they've got this new kind of bridge that the Native Americans have built. Anybody been on this bridge yet? Anybody been? I've wanted to do this. Okay, we've got a couple people that have been on that, where it is all glass and it goes out, 100 feet over the Grand Canyon, and you walk and you're looking underneath you and it's all glass. And so you get to see all the way down, however 50 million miles that is, or whatever that is that's out there. And so you can walk along there and be afraid of that. Anybody have ophidiophobia? Anybody have ophidiophobia? My father has this one. This is the fear of snakes. And so I don't know if you're afraid of that. Somebody's like, turn it off, turn it off. Yeah, I know. That's the fear of snakes. And that's a rational fear, I think, right now with this guy right there. And then there's another fear that you might have, and you've heard about this one. How many of you are afraid of spiders? Yeah, I'm okay with spiders till they get about the size of 1 or 2 foot long. And when they get that size, then I get scared of them. So I've got a real scary, is it going to scare you to even see a picture of the spider? Is there anybody got it that bad? So I want to warn you to turn your head if this is going to be, Anybody got that bad? Okay, don't look if you're afraid of spiders, because there we go, a real scary one for you. Didn't want to scare anybody with that one on that. Scare of that particular spider. But then there's also claustrophobia. You've heard about this one. These are people who are afraid of Santa Claus. And so that's kind of what claustrophobia is. No, actually, that's called Santaphobia. That's actually identifiable for the kid that you put on Santa's lap and that's really scary. But we're not going to talk about any of those phobias today. We're going to talk about this phobia. And you may not have heard of this phobia, but this phobia actually comes right out of the Scriptures. Because this is the fear of being different. Unisophobia. And it's the fear of being different. Now you say, where does that come from out of the Bible? Well, we've been studying through the book of 1 Samuel, and we've been really covering the 40 years of Eli. And originally I thought we would stop at the end of Eli, because last week Eli died. Remember? He was told by God that the day was coming that his sons were going to be killed because he was going to reject Eli and reject Eli's family as leaders over God's people because of their sinfulness and how they corrupted the rituals of God that he had given them. And so he had warned Eli that day was coming. And when that day came, it would be known to him that his two sons would die and that this would be the end. And so last week we read about that in 1 Samuel, of how that happened when the Hebrews, the Israelites, had taken as a lucky charm for themselves, a good luck charm, the Ark of the Covenant, and it was stolen. And Eli heard that news, fell over backwards in his chair, and broke his neck, and the end of his line had happened. In fact, one of his daughter-in-laws was lost in childbirth, and she even declared her son to be named Ichabod, meaning that the glory of the Lord has departed. And so we were going to end there with the time of Eli. But as I began to look at 1 Samuel and continue to read through it, 1 Samuel is just a fascinating story of transition. It's a fascinating story of how God worked in the midst of his people. And so today we're just going to continue that on, and we're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 8 today. And so we've gone to the first 7 chapters essentially over the last several weeks, and today we're going to come to chapter 8. And in chapter 8, we're going to see that God's people were afraid of being different. In fact, they did not want to be different from all of the other nations that were around them, and so they go to God with a request, and that request is, hey, God, we don't want you to be our king. We want an earthly king, a human king, a king that can lead us into battle, a king that can be our leader, the king that we can rally behind, and we want to be just like everybody else. And so today what we want to talk about is, as us being believers, as Christians, there are certain things about us that will always cause us to be different. And we're not going to be completely accepted in this world. We're not going to be completely applauded by this world. We're not always going to be advanced and promoted in this world because of our faith and our beliefs. And rather than being afraid of being different in this world and trying to be just like everybody else, we need to stand firm on God's calling in our life, on God's providential care over us, so that when we have to, that we can stand and be strong and be different from the world. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. 1 Samuel chapter 8. Here's what it says. When Samuel became old, and it happens to us, doesn't it? How many of you never planned on getting old? And here you are, right? Never planned on it. Never were expecting that. You grew up looking at old people and you go, boy, I'm not going to be like that when I get, and ta-da, here we are. You look in the mirror and you go, who stole me? There's not the person that I remember, and things just don't work like they used to. Well, I won't even go there. When Samuel became old, because it happens to all of us if we live long enough, he made his sons judges over Israel. Now, that's not uncommon. As you know, in the Scriptures, there is a lineage, there is a heritage, that there were certain people who were to be priests, certain people whose families are going to be set aside to be priests. So nothing unusual there, something that's supposed to happen. Samuel becomes old, makes his sons judges over Israel, but there's a problem with his sons. And that problem is going to sound familiar. Yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain, and they took bribes, and they perverted justice. Now, isn't that interesting? If you've been going through 1 Samuel with us, and you've been here, you've noticed that Eli got into trouble. God's people got into trouble because of what? His two sons, Phinehas and Hophni, were their names. Egyptian names, by the way, not Hebrew names. Always interesting to point that out for some reason. But his two sons were the ones who were causing all the trouble, were not doing what they're supposed to be doing. They went after gain, and they were taking, at least in some instances, perverting justice, maybe even taking bribes in some sense. But they were doing these things, and so God removed Eli's family, brought up a new kid who was not necessarily of a heritage of being a priest, brings him into that, and you know that kid's name. He grew up and got old, because that's who Samuel is. And so you would have thought that of all the kids, it would have been Samuel's kids who would have turned out right, because Samuel would have made sure that didn't happen, because it was Eli's sons who didn't do what they were supposed to that got Samuel in there in the first place. And you would think that Samuel would go, boys, you can't do this. But for whatever reason, Samuel's two sons turn out to some degree in the same line, the same situation as Eli's kids. Now here's a couple of things. We do not find in Scripture any disparagement, any blaming of Samuel in any of the Scriptures. In fact, Samuel is always spoken of as someone to be emulated, someone who had a high position, someone whose heart was after God. And he is not, at least in the Scriptures that I can find. If you can find some other ones, I'd love to see those. But there's no indication that Samuel is blamed for the way that his sons turned out. Now, it's very clear with Eli's kids, it does. Very clearly in the Scriptures. Eli gets the blame for his kids turning out the way and him not doing anything. In fact, if you've been with us, you know that there's conversation that happened in there, and yet God still God blamed or had the judgment upon Eli. Here, it doesn't seem to be that way. And so we don't know exactly, because we don't know fully the mind of God in everything. But we don't know if sometimes that you can put a child and you can raise up a child and provide everything for them and do everything that they're supposed to, and yet they choose to go their own way. And some of you have probably gone through that in your life and in your family, and maybe you've turned out to be great and you have a brother or sister who didn't turn out so great, or maybe you've got some children that have kind of caused some heartache for you. It's not always what we do to our children, because I have noticed, and you've noticed this too, that your children are individual people, aren't they? They're responsible for themselves, and our responsibility as parents and grandparents and family is to get them ready to stand on their own and to make their own decisions. And there are lots of times that you wish that you could override the decision of your children, right? That happens, right? Sometimes you wish you could override the decisions of your husband. I know, I understand that. And sometimes we'd want to do that, but for whatever the case, we're not allowed or we can't. And so I don't know, surely there's some blame on Samuel. There's got to be some blame on Samuel, but maybe not in the same way that it was for Eli. So whatever the circumstances, we don't fully understand this or fully know, but the elders of Israel gather together, and they gather at a particular place, and they come and they say to Samuel, Samuel, you're old. That's what they say to him. And Samuel's like, I don't need a committee to come and tell me that I'm old. But thanks, guys, I appreciate that. But they say, no. Not only are you old, your sons are not walking in your way. Samuel, you've been great. Samuel, we've loved you. In fact, you remember last 2 weeks ago, we talked about all the benefit of Samuel as leader. Remember the land that the Philistines had stolen was restored? You can look at this in the Scriptures. I think it's in chapter 7, right? I think that's where that is. And even the Amorites are friendly now. And the Philistines were defeated in battle, and the Philistines did not cause any trouble for God's people as long as Samuel was the judge. As long as Samuel was the ruler, the Philistines, the evil guys, the bad guys, they were at bay. But now the elders of Israel gather and they say, Samuel, you're getting old. You're not as young as you used to be. And your sons, who you've put in charge, are not doing what they're supposed to. So we want you to appoint for us a king to judge us like what? All the other nations. They don't have an illustration. They don't have a point to say, we want you to give us a king like you did back in the old days. They don't have any precedent for that. The way that they know about a king is that they have looked around, they've seen all of the other nations, and all the other nations have a king. And they look around and say, we would like a king to be just like everybody else, because being different, it's different sometimes. Have you ever felt different in a room? Have you ever felt that way? It is a scary feeling to be different. I had a friend of mine who was a band director, and he was a practice band director. I guess you call those practice teachers or whatever. They're teachers in training. I don't know what the fancy term is today, but in the old days, we called them practice teachers. And he was an African-American gentleman. And his name was Harold Fooster. And so that's bad enough trouble if you're an African-American man named Harold. I mean, that's going to be enough trouble in your life. And so his name is Harold Fooster. And Mr. Fooster would tell me stories because he lived like in Chicago, and he would have to drive through some of the Midwest, which is not fully friendly to African Americans, or it wasn't in those days, and he would tell me the stories of going into a Walmart, being the only African American man in town, and they would call over the intercom, and they would say things like, security check on aisle 4, and he would look and say, oh, I'm in aisle 4. That's kind of interesting. And he walked to another aisle, be in aisle 8, and then security check on aisle 8. And everywhere he went, there was that security check, and he said it just kind of a different feeling to feel like we're different in that setting. And maybe you've done the same thing. Maybe you've gone someplace. I remember had a student who went down to Mexico at Wilcox. They went down to Mexico on the beach, and he was like a 9th grader. And he came back. I said, Ben, how did it go? And Ben said, man, it was great, but there were all these foreigners there. And I'm like, Ben, no, Ben, you were the foreigner. That's Mexico. That's where all, and so I had a hard time kind of communicating that with him. But, we don't really always do real well being different, do we? We spend a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of money looking like everybody else, pursuing oftentimes all of the same goals. And so that's what God's people are. Hey, look, we know where this goes. We saw Phineas and Hophni. We didn't like the way that worked. And so your sons are really not any better. So could you appoint for us a judge like all the other nations? Now Samuel took this really, really hard. Verse 6, I think it is. He takes this really, really hard. He goes back to God and complains to God and says, God, I can't believe this, that they would want somebody else besides that. And here's what in verse 7 the Lord says to Samuel, obey the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Samuel's upset because, he probably likes his boys to some degree, and he's got maybe hope that God's going to turn their life around, and when he's dead, they're going to be better. I don't know what Samuel's thinking, but Samuel takes this personally as if the people are rejecting him as leader, and God says, oh, no, Samuel, this is not about you and the people. This is about me and the people. Isn't it interesting how quickly we forget God's provision for us? It's so funny to me how quickly we forget that, oh, God was faithful yesterday. Oh, God, that was great. But, whoa, today is a whole new ballgame. God, are you going to get me through that? Yeah, I know you got me through that one. I appreciate that, God. Thank you very much. But now I got this problem right now. God, are you going to help me this time? And we're always looking forward, going, oh, is God going to be able to do this? God, help us on that. And so the people are concerned that Samuel is old, and since Samuel's going to die and his kids aren't going to be right, we're going to be in trouble. But do you remember how God solved that last problem that God's people were in? He brought him a Samuel. See, far too often we want to take control. And I'm going to talk to me now for a minute, so don't even listen to this part. But so many times often I want to take control over what's happening so that I can make sure that it doesn't go wrong. Now, do you know anybody like this? Besides me, I know, besides me. Do you know anybody who tries to take over, to control everything so it doesn't go wrong because God forbid that they weren't in charge of something, because the world might come to an end if they weren't in charge. You know people like this, don't you? And so many times we are people like that. And we're concerned that, well, God's not going to be able to do this. And so they go to God and say, Samuel, give us a king. Samuel goes to God saying, I don't know that we should have a king. And they're rejecting me. God says, give them what they want. And then he kind of goes through and tells them what's going to happen if they get a king. Now, we're going to talk about that next week. And so next week we're going to have a little bit of a political discussion, because we're going to talk about what happens to governments, human governments. We're going to talk about that. And so it'll be a lot of fun. You don't want to miss that next week as your pastor talks about politics, all right? Some of you are not even going to show up, I understand. But we're going to talk a little bit about this, because God warns the people what happens when you have a king. Because the king's going to ask for your stuff. The king's going to take your children. He's going to take the stuff. And everything that was yours, he was going to take for himself. And by the way, that's always a danger of government. We're going to talk about that. But so he warns him. And so the Lord says, Samuel, no, go ahead and do that. Obey the voice of the people. And then he tells him, go ahead and do this. Now then, obey their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. So he goes and warns them, tells them all these bad things that are going to happen. If you want a king, you're rejecting God. Now you want a king, it's going to be bad for you. All these bad things are going to happen. And the people go, we don't care. We don't care. We actually want the king. Verse 19, but the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, we don't care. We want a king over us so that we also may be, there it is again. I didn't make this up. See, it's there again. That we may be like all the nations and that our king may judge us. Who was judging them at this point? God was, through Samuel, appointed person by God, and that this king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. We want a king so that we can be like everybody else. So Samuel said to the men of Israel, fine, go every man to his city. And then they create this process that God's going to give them to find the king, and they're going to point out the man that everybody's going to think is the right man, and they're going to look at him and think this is wonderful. And we're going to talk about that in 2 weeks, and so we're going to be in 1 Samuel for a little while as we kind of go through this process. But what does all of this mean for us when we think about these things? Well, I've got a couple of points just to make sure that it's not pointless. It is okay, point number one, for you to be you. It's okay. In fact, it's really kind of good that you are who God has created you to be. So many times we don't want to be who we are. We want to be like them, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. But from this passage, we've got to understand that because God has called us, we're always going to be a little different from this world, or at least we should be. Now, I'm not saying that it's wrong to kind of be like the world and to kind of look like everything, but it's okay for us to be different in this world with a different attitude, a different mindset, a different focus on our attention. And one of the greatest things that we have is that in Branson we have an environment where not only is it okay to be a Christian, it's kind of required almost. Don't they make you sign something when you move to Branson now that you got to be a Christian, you're going to follow all those kind of things? Well, please understand that is not the way that the rest of the world works. And so while you're in Branson, everything's kind of nice and cozy, and we've got our own problems to understand that. But when you go to other places, they're not going to be like us, and there is this pressure on us to be like everybody else. Doesn't the Scripture tell us that we are not? Do not be conformed to what? To this world. That word conformed, it really has that idea of being pressed into. It's almost like I don't know if you've done this or not, but Jell-O. You like Jell-O? I like Jell-O, and in the cold winter, I like warm Jell-O. I like to drink warm Jell-O. Does anybody else drink warm Jell-O? If you've not tried that in the winter, try that. Okay, I got one testimony. Try that in the winter, especially with sore throat. I do that. But you know, some of you, that you can take warm Jell-O, and when you put Jell-O into whatever container that you put that Jell-O in, that it takes the shape of that Jell-O, right? You know that. It's not rocket science to you. You know this, right? And so you can put that, if you put that in a bundt pan kind of thing to make those little Jell-O salad kind of things, kind of jiggle and all that kind of stuff. If you put that in a bundt pan, you know what kind of shaped Jell-O you have? You have bundt pan shaped Jell-O. That's what you got, right? And if you put it in a round container, you got what? You got round Jell-O, because Jell-O takes the shape as it congeals, hence the term gel. Once it congeals, it takes that shape, doesn't it? Well, that Scripture is talking about that we should not be conformed to this world and do not allow this world to shape us and mold us, because we're kind of like warm Jell-O oftentimes. And many of us just kind of take up the attitude and the atmosphere of the people that are around us. Now, that doesn't mean that we should be dressed differently just to dress differently. You've seen some people that do that who are believers or confessing believers, and you can look at them and you go, aha, we know what you are because you're not dressed like anybody else. And so I'm not saying that we should do that, though I have appreciation for those who choose to do that. But it is okay for us to be us, and in this world we're going to be different. And if we stand for the things of the gospel, even kind of, we're going to stand out more and more and more in this world. And it should be, we're going to recognize that that's okay if that happens. So that's number one. It's okay for us to be us. Number two, don't be jealous for what you are not. God's people are looking around and saying, well, everybody else got a king. We ought to have a king. So they want a king. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with the king. Unless your king is God and you choose to have another king. And in some way, when you're always jealous for what you are not or what you don't have, you are in some way saying to God, God, I am not satisfied with where I am or who you've made me to be. Because I want to be like them, whoever them are. We all want to be different just like everybody else, right? I mean, that's kind of our mindset. We want to be different just like everybody else, and we want to be just like everybody else. And so we got to spend our time not being jealous over what we're not. And it's so difficult to do because we want to fit in, we want to be this, we want to be that. We can't do that. 3, I got to move on, time's up. Time always runs out on me. There's going to be some Sunday where time does not run out. I'm just going to be talking all day long, and it's going to work out great. Just 3 services, y'all will just come in and out in the 3 services, and I'll just be preaching, and you'll just pick up wherever I am, and it's kind of, that's an idea, not a very good one, but number 3, trust God, don't reject his kingship. And maybe the people weren't rejecting God. Maybe they didn't realize that's what they were doing, but that's what they really were doing. Because God may ask us to walk through some things, to live through some things, to be involved in some things where we may or may not want that. I'm sure the people were looking and they were saying, you know what, if we go through this whole thing again with these 2 sons that don't do what they're supposed to, we know how this ends, so we just want to bypass that. We want to shortcut that, but that's not what God wanted. So trust God and don't reject his kingship over you. So let me boil it down to this, and then we got to go. Are you okay being different? I'm not saying be different to be different. I'm not saying that. But in this world, because here's what's happened. In the world, in the past, you and I have been kind of in the middle culturally. Because pretty much everybody, knew sin was wrong. At least they tried to hide it, They knew something was wrong, so they would hide it. And so you and I, our views, our beliefs, we're kind of in the middle of the country. I mean, we were God and country in America and Branson and all that kind of stuff. We're right here, and we've been in the center of culture. We've been the backbone of whatever's happened. But I don't know if you know this or not, but everything is kind of shifted now. And so you and I still have the same beliefs, the same ideas, the same positions on everything, and we haven't moved a single step. But the whole culture has moved to the left on many things. And because of that, now you and I, because everything has shifted, there used to be on this side, used to be on that side, now everything is kind of moved over there, so we haven't moved, but our culture has moved, and so what? We're the right-wing wackos. It's where we are now. It's where we're being identified as. And so many people are going, well, we can't be that, so we've got to accept this, because we don't want to be over that far. And we don't want to be like that, so we've got to accept this, and so we've got to move over. And the truth is that when we do that, we abandon who God has called us to be. And so in the next years, we're going to have to stand firm, and we're going to have to be okay being different in this. And we haven't moved, but our culture has. And so are we willing to be different and have God as our ultimate king? I'm not for theocracy. I'm not asking everybody to bow and have a prayer in our government. It's not talking about that kind of stuff. But are we willing to recognize that God is our king and the ultimate king for us? Would you bow your heads and close your eyes? It's tough being different in the world. I know that. And it's kind of even tough sometimes to allow God to be our king. And so maybe there's some people out there today who you don't have God as your king. You've never bowed before him. You just think that you're okay with God just because you're here. But that's not the case. You have to bow your knee to the King of all kings, who is God himself, who came to us in the form of Jesus, as Jesus, because he is Jesus. And maybe you can't reject his kingship because you never received it. And so maybe today God's stirring in your heart the idea that, you know what, I need God as my king, not some human government or not some boss or not somebody like that. The only way that you can do that is if you bow your life, repenting of your sin, asking for the forgiveness of Christ, and believing on his name, and that can happen today if you'll ask him to. There are some of us out there, though, we've already done that. He's our king, but we've almost rejected him because we don't want to live that way all the time, or it's hard to live that way. We don't want to stick out. We don't want to be different, and so we kind of go along with everybody, and we laugh at the same jokes, and we pursue the same things, and we want the same things, and yet when we do that, we are abandoning our king because he's asked us to be different in this world. And so maybe today God's calling you back to him, that you might be a little different for him and allow him to be the Lord of your life. Or maybe there's something else going on in your life. Maybe there's another kind of battle, has nothing to do with what we've been talking about today, but you want to talk to somebody. Our prayer partners are here. We're going to pray for you. And if there's anything else we can do, we want to help today Got some great Bible studies that we'd love for you to attend so that you can learn more about the ways of our God. But right now, what I want to do is to pray for you and ask God to move in our hearts. Father, we thank you for this time that you've given us.